Comrades, let us confront an uncomfortable truth. The so-called progress of the economy is not the progress of humanity. While markets surge, stocks climb, and corporations boast record profits, the laborer trudges home weary, the peasant bears the weight of exploitation, and the common worker is left to navigate the ruins of their own survival. The machinery of wealth churns forward, but its gains are not shared among those who make it possible. They are hoarded by a parasitic few, whose power rests upon the subjugation of the many. This is not accident. It is not misfortune. It is the natural law of capitalism, the system in which the fruits of collective labor are appropriated by a tiny elite, while the laboring masses are shackled to insecurity, poverty, and dependence. The economy grows, yet people are left behind. The coffers of the ruling class overflow while families go hungry, the streets shine with neon luxury while schools crumble, and medicine is a commodity rather than a human right. This is the reality that ideology demands we ignore, that religion, politics mask as inevitable, that the press presents as progress. Observe the mechanisms of this exploitation. Every wage paid to a worker is less than the value of the labor produced. This surplus value extracted from the very hands that built, planted, and sustained the world is the source of capitalist wealth. Every profit earned, every dividend distributed, every luxurious mansion erected is the embodiment of stolen labor. And yet the workers continue to toil, believing that the system rewards diligence, that advancement is meritocratic, that progress is impartial. But the economy is impartial only to profit. It is blind to justice, deaf to suffering, and hostile to the emancipation of those whose labor sustains it. We must recognize that this system is not an abstract entity, but a social relation maintained by ideology, law, and the apparatus of the state. Schools teach obedience, media teach consumption, and religion teaches patience, all to cultivate docility among those whose hands feed the engines of capital. The ruling class does not fear chaos, it fears consciousness. It does not fear rebellion, it fears solidarity. It does not fear poverty itself. It fears the moment the workers realize that poverty is imposed and that its continuation depends on division, distraction, and submission. Comrades, the struggle is not merely for wages, not merely for survival. It is for the reclamation of human dignity, for the assertion of collective power, for the dismantling of a system that treats people as instruments of production rather than as free, thinking, and living beings. The emancipation of labor is the emancipation of humanity. And emancipation is not granted, it is seized through understanding, through organization, and through action. The unity of the working class is our weapon. The knowledge that we create all value, that we are the producers of wealth, and that the prosperity of the few rests upon our exploitation is our strength. When workers, peasants, and the oppressed act in concert, we hold in our hands the power to redirect the course of history. The economy cannot advance without us. The markets, the corporations, the banks all depend upon our labor, our energy, and our compliance. If we withdraw that labor, if we refuse to accept subjugation, if we organize and act collectively, the foundations of exploitation will crumble beneath the weight of our solidarity. Comrades, the hour demands clarity and courage. It is not enough to lament the inequality around us, to point at injustice and retreat to private comfort. We must educate, we must unite, and we must struggle. The chains that bind the many to the service of the few are forged in silence, maintained by fear, and legitimized by ideology. Break the silence, shatter the fear, reject the lies, organize the masses, for in the unity of the exploited lies the power to create a society where the economy serves the people, not the other way around. The economy moves forward, yes, but unless we rise, it moves without us. It grows while we remain shackled. It prospers while we are abandoned. History belongs to those who take it, not to those who wait for crumbs. Rise, comrades! Organize, educate, and seize the power that is rightfully ours. The time for action is now. The instrument of change is solidarity, and the horizon of justice lies in the collective strength of the people. The economy advances, but the working class is left behind. And this is the central contradiction of modern society, the fracture upon which the entire capitalist system rests. We are told of growth, of progress, of rising GDP, of the numbers flashing green across the screen, of stock markets, of multinational corporations expanding into every corner of the globe. Yet beneath this glittering facade lies a profound and inescapable reality. The people who produce all this wealth, who toil, sweat, and innovate, see little to none of the benefits that are claimed to be society as collective prosperity. The factories hum with energy, the offices buzz with productivity, the supply chains stretch around the world, and yet the very hands that keep these engines in motion are denied security, comfort, or dignity. While wealth accumulates for a tiny elite, the majority of the population struggles under stagnant wages, precarious employment, insufficient housing, and the relentless pressure of survival. This is not a minor imbalance. It is the structural inevitability of a system built on exploitation. The economy is measured in numbers, in profits, in abstract indexes, but the measure of human life is omitted, rendered invisible by ideology and normalized as the cost of progress. The advanced economy, we are told, is a boon to society, yet in reality it is a machine that advances the interests of the few at the expense of the many. The worker as labor is commodified, quantified, and exchanged, but the value created exceeds the compensation received. Every innovation, every improvement in production, every expansion of markets represents more labor extracted without fair reward, more surplus value concentrated in the hands of capitalists, more social wealth that bypasses those who created it. This gap between the advancement of the economy and the condition of the working class is not accidental, it is intentional, systemic, and ideologically reinforced. The ruling class justifies it through a narrative of meritocracy, entrepreneurship, and individual effort, convincing workers that their deprivation is a result of personal failure rather than systemic oppression. They are told to work harder, to innovate, to be flexible, to compete with their peers, all while the fruits of their labor are siphoned off to enrich owners of capital, shareholders, and financiers who contribute nothing to the actual production of goods and services. Meanwhile, the cost of living rises, housing becomes unaffordable, healthcare is commodified, and education is increasingly inaccessible. Workers are left with the illusion of opportunity while facing the reality of exploitation. Their labor powers the growth of corporations, fills the coffers of banks, and sustains the luxurious lifestyles of the wealthy, yet the workers themselves remain tethered to survival, always a step behind the very economy they sustain. This is the essence of alienation, where the worker becomes a stranger to the product of their labor, to the process of production, and ultimately to themselves. The economy moves forward, but the working class is left behind because the system is designed to prioritize capital over human need, profit over well-being, accumulation over equity. Every policy that claims to support growth, tax cuts for corporations, incentives for investors, deregulation of markets serves the same end, to widen the gap between the owners of wealth and those who produce it. Historical patterns reinforce this inequality. Industrial revolutions, technological innovations, globalization, and financialization have all advanced the capacity of economies, yet the distribution of wealth remains starkly unequal. Workers in every era have created unprecedented value, yet social hierarchies persist, reinforce the logic that advancement in production does not equate to advancement in human conditions. The contradiction is evident in every city, every workplace, every neighborhood. Skyscrapers tower over slums, luxury cars pass by overcrowded buses, tech billionaires amass fortunes while essential workers struggle to pay rent. The economy is lauded as a symbol of progress, yet the conditions of those who labor are evidence of regression, of a system that moves forward only to leave behind the majority. This disconnect generates tension, unrest, and moral crisis. The working class experiences firsthand the injustice of being indispensable yet undervalued. They witness the growing opulence of a few and the stagnation or decline of their own living standards. Awareness of this gap is the seed of consciousness, the spark that can ignite collective action. Yet it is suppressed by ideology, by cultural narratives that obscure structural exploitation, by the pressure of survival that leave little space for reflection, and by divisions among workers themselves. The economy moves forward, but the working class is left behind because systemic mechanisms favor capital accumulation, maintain social hierarchies, and ensure that labor remains a commodity, not a determinant of societal progress. The wealth generated by collective human effort is appropriated, while those who generate it are subjected to precarity, inequality, and alienation, creating a society where economic growth is not synonymous with human advancement. Capitalism thrives on the extraction of surplus value from labor, and it is through this extraction that the entire edifice of capitalist power is constructed and maintained. The worker, who produces the goods and services that sustain society, receives a wage that represents only a fraction of the value their labor creates. The difference between what labor produces and what it is paid is surplus value, and it is precisely this surplus that is the lifeblood of the capitalist class, the source of their profits, their privileges, and their dominance over society. This process is not incidental. It is the defining characteristic of capitalism. Every factory, every office, every mine, and every farm operates not to satisfy human need, but to generate surplus that can be appropriated by those who own the means of production. The laborer's toil generates wealth that is systematically removed from their possession, leaving them compensated only with enough to reproduce their labor power, to maintain themselves sufficiently to return to work the next day. This extraction is disguised as a natural and fair exchange, but it is a legal and social arrangement designed to conceal the exploitation inherent in the wage system. From the earliest moments of industrial capitalism, the extraction of surplus value has structured economic relations, create a class of people who live by the labor of others, and a class of people whose labor is continually appropriated. Machines and technology, rather than liberating workers, are used to intensify labor, increase productivity, and expand the potential for surplus extraction. The capitalist invests in machinery not to improve the life of the worker, but to enhance the efficiency of production and, by extension, the amount of surplus value that can be claimed. Even when workers are given slightly higher wages or improved working conditions, the logic of surplus extraction remains. The laborer produces more value than they consume, and the excess is captured by capital. This dynamic explains why, despite rising productivity and technological advancement, the living standards of workers often stagnate, while the wealth of the capitalist class multiplies. It is the systematic nature of this extraction that underlies the accumulation of capital, the concentration of wealth, and the creation of social inequality. The capitalist system depends on the continued alienation of labor, ensuring that workers do not recognize the full extent of the value they produce or the means by which it is taken from them. By presenting wages as fair compensation and profits as the reward for risk or ingenuity, the system naturalizes exploitation. embedding it in social norms, legal frameworks, and cultural narratives. Surplus value is not only economic but ideological. It perpetuates a hierarchy in which those who control production dictate the conditions of life for the many. This extraction takes multiple forms: the obvious wage gap, the unpaid labor hidden in extended working hours, the undervaluation of essential labor, and the systemic devaluation of those whose work is necessary but socially or culturally marginalized. In every case, the logic is consistent. Labor must produce more than it consumes, and the excess is claimed by the owner of capital. Historically, the extraction of surplus value has been enforced through coercion, law, and social institutions. Slavery, colonial exploitation, child labor, and the oppression of women are extreme but illustrative forms of the same principle. Human labor is treated as a commodity, and its value is appropriated by those who wield economic power. Even in contemporary capitalist societies, where formal slavery is abolished, the principle persists through wage, labor, debt, and precarious employment, ensuring that workers remain dependent while their labor enriches others. The expansion of global capitalism has intensified this process, creating international networks in which surplus value is extracted from workers in one region to enrich consumers and capitalists elsewhere. Exploitation is therefore both local, global, structural and systemic, normalized and invisible to those who benefit from it. The capitalist class thrives precisely because this extraction is continuous and cumulative. Surplus value is reinvested to generate more capital, to expand markets, to develop technology, and to secure political power, creating a self-perpetuating cycle that deepens inequality and entrenches class division. The worker remains bound to this cycle, contributing labor that sustains the system while being denied the fruits of their own productivity. Understanding surplus value is critical to understanding the dynamics of capitalism itself. It is the foundation of profits, the engine of accumulation, and the mechanism that ensures the continued dominance of the few over the many. Every economic policy, every corporate strategy, every market innovation can be traced back to the imperative to extract more surplus from labor, to convert human effort into capital, and to expand wealth for the ruling class, while maintaining the dependency and subjugation of the working class. Without this extraction, capitalism cannot function, for it is precisely the unequal distribution of labor's fruits that makes the system possible, stable and profitable, and it is through this process that inequality is reproduced across generations, leaving the majority to toil for the enrichment of a few. Ideology, law, and institutions maintain inequality and submission, and they do so with a precision that renders exploitation invisible to those who suffer it most. The ruling class does not rely solely on brute force to dominate society. It relies upon a system of social, political, and cultural mechanisms that naturalize hierarchy and render oppression seemingly inevitable. Schools, media, religion, and legal structures work in concert to reproduce the conditions necessary for the continuation of economic inequality, instilling in the minds of the working class the belief that the existing order is fair, just, and unchangeable. Ideology operates as the lens through which people perceive reality, framing wealth as the reward for merit, poverty as the consequence of laziness or incompetence, and social mobility as a function of individual effort rather than structural advantage. From childhood, workers are taught to accept authority, to revere property, to aspire to success within the very system that exploits them, and to internalize the values of those who profit from their labor. Religion, in its institutionalized forms, often reinforces this submission, promising rewards in a distant afterlife while legitimizing inequality in the present, instructing the oppressed to endure suffering as virtuous or inevitable. Law, far from serving justice equally, codifies the power of property and capital, protects the privileges of the elite, and sanctions the exploitation of labor. Property rights, contracts, corporate protections, and labor laws are designed to manage dissent, rather than to ensure equity, to regulate the exploitation of workers rather than to prevent it. Institutions, such as the police, the judiciary, and regulatory agencies function as mechanisms of enforcement, ensuring that any challenge to the status quo is contained, punished, or redirected into channels that do not threaten the system. Stability. Even the most basic social services, education, healthcare, housing are structured in ways that reproduce dependence and maintain hierarchical relations, offering minimal relief while leaving structural barriers intact. Ideology, law, and institutions operate together as a triad of control, ensuring that the economic exploitation inherent in capitalism is experienced as natural rather than constructed, as individual misfortune rather than collective oppression. They obscure the extraction of surplus value, disguise the alienation of labor, and mask the concentration of wealth as the outcome of personal virtue rather than social engineering. Political parties, media conglomerates, and corporate lobbying reinforce the same patterns by shaping public opinion, framing discourse, and prioritizing policies that serve capital rather than people. Elections and political debates often focus on superficial differences, competing personalities, or minor reforms, while the structural foundations of inequality, ownership of production, wage suppression, and profit extraction remain untouched. Workers are encouraged to see themselves as individuals in competition with one another rather than as a class, with shared interests, ensuring that potential collective action is fragmented before it can take root. Cultural norms further entrench submission. Success is glorified as personal achievement, while resistance is stigmatized as irrational or destructive. Meritocracy is preached as a guiding principle, encouraging workers to aspire to a small slice of wealth while ignoring the systemic constraints that limit access to it. Social rituals, entertainment, and consumer culture all contribute to distraction, shaping desires that align with capitalist interests rather than human need. Ideology, law, and institutions also serve to normalize crises, framing economic recessions, layoffs, and inequality as unfortunate but unavoidable aspects of the market rather than predictable outcomes of an exploitative system. Welfare programs, social assistance, and charitable initiatives, while appearing to mitigate suffering, often reinforce dependency and obscure the mechanisms of exploitation, giving the appearance of care while leaving systemic injustice intact. The internalization of these structures ensures that workers rarely question the legitimacy of authority, rarely perceive the shared basis of their exploitation, and rarely organize collectively to challenge the system. Education, rather than liberating minds, often reproduces social hierarchies by teaching skills and knowledge suited to maintaining existing economic relations rather than to challenging them. Legal codes, rather than protecting the oppressed, protect the property and privilege of the powerful, ensuring that disputes over wealth and power are adjudicated in ways that reinforce rather than disrupt inequality. Institutions, whether economic, political, or social, function as mechanisms of habituation, shaping expectations, behavior, and consciousness in ways that secure consent for exploitation. The worker comes to see hierarchy as natural, competition as necessary, and submission as inevitable, while the structures that generate and sustain inequality remain hidden in plain sight. Understanding this dynamic is essential to revolutionary consciousness. Only by recognizing the role of ideology, law, and institutions in perpetuating oppression can the working class perceive the systemic nature of their exploitation and the necessity of collective action. To challenge inequality effectively, it is not enough to demand higher wages or minor reforms. It is necessary to dismantle the structures that legitimize exploitation, to unmask the ideologies that pacify the oppressed, and to reconstruct society in a way that prioritizes human need over private profit, labor over capital, and justice over hierarchical submission. Workers' unity and collective action are the path to liberation. And this truth is as old as class society itself, yet as urgent today as ever. Alone the worker is powerless, subjected to the dictates of capital, vulnerable to the whims of the market, and trapped within the narrow confines of survival. The division of labor, competition among peers, and the isolation imposed by capitalism. Ideology create the illusion that each individual stands alone, responsible for their own fortune or misfortune, when in reality the power to transform society lies precisely in the shared strength of those who labor. History demonstrates this principle repeatedly. Revolutions, uprisings, and movements for social justice have always been successful only when the oppressed recognize their common interests and acted together. Solidarity transforms exploitation from an abstract grievance into a tangible force capable of challenging power. When workers unite, they confront the system that depends upon their submission, their division, and their alienation. The factories, the farms, the offices, the streets, every space of production and labor becomes a potential site of resistance, for these are the spaces in which the collective power of the working class is concentrated. Individual effort produces wealth for the capitalist. Collective effort can seize that wealth, demand justice, and reshape society. Collective action is not merely protest, it is the conscious coordination of efforts, the recognition that the liberation of one worker is bound, the liberation of all, and the understanding that systemic change is impossible without the active participation of those who sustain the economy. Trade unions, labor movements, cooperatives, strikes, and other forms of organized action exemplify the capacity of workers to challenge exploitation and assert their rights. The strike, in particular, illustrates the paradoxical power of the worker. Although the capitalist controls capital and infrastructure, the worker controls the lifeblood of production, and withdrawal of that labor exposes the dependence of the system upon the very people it oppresses. The fear of collective action drives the ruling class to fragment, intimidate, and ideologically manipulate workers, yet these tactics reveal the fundamental truth that capital cannot exist without labor. This interdependence is the foundation of revolutionary potential. Workers. Unity extends beyond immediate economic concerns. It encompasses the shared struggle for dignity, social recognition, and human freedom. It is not enough to seek temporary relief, higher wages, or improved conditions, while remaining divided along lines of ethnicity, gender, nationality, or skill. Capital thrives on these divisions, using them to pit workers against one another, to foster resentment, and to obscure the systemic roots of exploitation. True unity requires consciousness, the understanding that the interests of the working class are inherently collective, that the oppression of one group diminishes the freedom of all, and that liberation is inseparable from solidarity. This consciousness is cultivated through education, dialogue, and shared struggle. Workers learn not only their common grievances, but also their collective power, discovering that by acting together, they can transform workplaces, communities, and society at large. Unity is therefore both strategic and moral. It enables effective resistance and nurtures a sense of human interconnection that capitalism seeks to erode. The path to liberation is further illuminated by historical examples, from the labor revolt of the industrial era to the revolutionary movements of the 20th century. In each case, progress was achieved not through isolated heroism but through the discipline and organized efforts of May, acting in recognition of shared oppression and mutual benefit. Attempts to fragment these movements through state repression propaganda, or co-optation demonstrate that the ruling class understands the threat posed by worker solidarity. Capitalism, despite its technological sophistication and financial complexity, is vulnerable precisely because it depends on the cooperation of those it exploits. When workers refuse to cooperate, when they organize across industries, communities, and borders, the system's fragility is exposed and its capacity to extract surplus, control labor, and dictate social relations is undermined. Collective action is therefore not optional but necessary. It is the vehicle through which the working class moves from passive victimhood to active agency, from alienation to empowerment, and from exploitation to emancipation. Workers' unity transform scattered grievances into organized power, turning the conditions of oppression into instruments of resistance. The recognition of this power is the first step toward a society in which human labor serves human need rather than private profit, in which economic and social arrangement reflect collective interests rather than individual accumulation, and in which freedom, equality, and justice are not abstract ideals but lived realities. Without unity and coordinated action, workers remain subject to the mechanisms of exploitation, fragmented and powerless, while the system of capital perpetuates inequality, alienation, and subjugation. Emancipation requires education, organization, and revolutionary struggle, for without understanding the oppressed remain blind to the chains that bind them. Without coordination, their efforts dissipate into ineffectiveness, and without struggle, power is never wrested from those who hold it. Education is the foundation of consciousness. It is the process through which workers recognize the structure of exploitation, the mechanisms of oppression, and the sources of their collective strength. To be emancipated is to be informed, to perceive the social, economic, and political forces that shape one's life, and to understand that the conditions of labor, the distribution of wealth, and the organization of society are not natural or immutable, but constructed to benefit a ruling class at the expense of the majority. Education does not mean the accumulation of technical skills alone or the mastery of marketable knowledge. It is the cultivation of critical thought, the ability to question authority, and the comprehension of history as a struggle between classes. Through education, workers learn to see beyond ideology, to discern the difference between appearance and reality, and to recognize that their labor is the source of all value while the structures of capital appropriate it. Organization is the next essential step, for understanding alone cannot change material conditions. Isolated knowledge produces individual enlightenment but leaves systemic power untouched. Collective organization transforms insight into action, creating structures through which workers can coordinate their efforts, strategize effectively, and challenge the dominance of capital. Unions, councils, cooperatives, and other forms of organized association are not merely administrative mechanisms, they are instruments of power, tools through which the laboring class asserts control over production, negotiates conditions, and confronts exploitation directly. The strength of organization lies in unity, in shared purpose, and in the ability to amplify the voices and actions of many into a force capable of influencing society and redistributing power. Revolutionary struggle is the culmination of education and organization, the conscious, deliberate effort to overthrow or fundamentally transform a system that perpetuates inequality and subjugation. Struggle is not limited to sporadic protests, petitions, or reforms. It is a sustained, collective endeavor aimed at dismantling the structure of capital, reclaiming the wealth produced by labor, and constructing new social relations in which human needs take precedence over profit. Revolutionary struggle is both defensive and offensive. It protects the gains of workers, resists encroachment by the ruling class, and challenges the very foundations of a system that depends on exploitation. History demonstrates that such struggle is necessary, for those who hold power rarely relinquish it voluntarily. Concessions offered by capital, wages, benefits, legal protections are granted only under pressure, as partial responses to organized resistance rather than acts of generosity. The oppressed must therefore be active, strategic and persistent, recognizing that liberation is a process, not an event. Education, organization and struggle are interdependent. Education informs strategy and clarifies objectives. Organization channels collective effort and maintains discipline. Struggle actualizes the potential of knowledge and coordination. Without education, organization becomes blind. Without organization, struggle becomes chaotic. Without struggle, education and organization remain abstract and impotent. Together, they form a triad of emancipation, equipping the working class with the tools necessary to confront systemic injustice, resist domination, and reclaim control over their lives. Emancipation also requires solidarity across industries, communities, and borders, for capital operates globally, exploiting labor wherever it can be cheapest and most vulnerable. Workers separated by geography, language, or trade are easier to divide, manipulate, and suppress. Education fosters awareness of shared conditions and collective interest. Organization unites workers across divisions. Struggle challenges exploitation wherever it occurs, building networks of solidarity capable of confronting a global system. Ideological struggle is equally vital, for emancipation is not solely material but also intellectual. The ideas propagated by the ruling class, meritocracy, individualism, competition, and obedience, must be confronted and replaced with a consciousness rooted in collective interest, equality, and justice. The emancipated worker is therefore not only a laborer but a thinker, a strategist, and an agent of systemic change. Emancipation is impossible without risk, courage, and sacrifice for those who challenge. Entrenched power threatens interests that have been defended for generations. Yet these challenges are necessary, for the chains of exploitation will not dissolve without pressure, resistance, and confrontation. Revolutionary struggle is the crucible in which education and organization are tested, refined, and made effective. It is through struggle that the abstract recognition of injustice is transformed into concrete action, that solidarity is proven, and that the potential of the working class to remake society is realized. Only by combining education, organization, and struggle can the working class escape alienation, reclaim the value of their labor, and construct a society in which human freedom, dignity, and equality are not ideals deferred, but realities experienced, comrades. The reality we face is stark but clear. The economy moves forward while the working class is left behind. Capitalism thrives on the extraction of surplus value from our labor, and ideology, law, and institutions serve to maintain inequality and submission. Yet in the midst of oppression there exists a path forward, a route to emancipation forged through the unity of workers, the organization of collective action, and the unwavering pursuit of revolutionary struggle. Our labor produces the wealth of society. Our solidarity is the weapon that can reclaim it. Education illuminates the mechanisms of exploitation. Organization channels our strength, and struggle transforms awareness into power. History has proven that progress never comes from the consent of the few, but from the courage of the many who refuse to accept injustice. The chains of oppression are not immutable. They are created, maintained, and, therefore, can be dismantled by human action. It is our task to rise above division, to recognize our shared interests, and to act together with clarity, discipline, and conviction. Only by seizing our collective power can we redirect the economy to serve humanity rather than capital, transform institutions to serve justice rather than privilege, and build a society in which labor is valued, equality is real, and freedom is universal. The moment demands courage. The means demand solidarity, and the future demands that the working class recognize itself as the agent of history, capable of reshaping the world in accordance with human need, dignity and liberation.